So welcome. Thank you very much for coming this evening. My name is Alison Mears. I'm the director of the Healthy Materials Lab at Parsons. Thank you for joining us this evening. We'll start. So we have our four presenters at the front, and basically the format of this short activity is really around a series of presentations by our four presenters, and then time for discussion afterwards, kind of addressing some of the questions we think are most pressing. And then if we have time, questions from the audience. We hope to finish by about 7:30. We have a reception outside that you're all welcome to attend when we're finished and continue on the conversations that we hope will start that are prompted by the discussion that we're having this evening. So welcome. So during the fall, we hosted 3 lectures in collaboration with the Health Product Declaration Collaborative, describing the importance of specifying healthier building products and highlighting the importance of product transparency. So this work is part of a larger collaboration, the Healthy Affordable Materials Project, which is a collaboration between these 4 entities. With us, Parsons Healthy Materials Lab, the Healthy Building Network, Green Science Policy Institute, and the Health Product Declaration Collaborative. In this 4th discussion in this series, we specifically address how this issue of healthier materials and transparency, impacts architectural practice, and how we address in particular the needs of vulnerable populations. At the Healthy Materials Lab, that's us and this thing we've had going for the last 4 years, we forefront those vulnerabilities of a number of populations, from people living in poverty, pregnant women and young children, young adults, and seniors. Inevitably, we're all exposed to unnecessary chemicals in our built environments. And as architects and designers, we work to remove these chemicals from our practices. That's our intention, anyway. In our work at the Healthy Materials Lab, we documented a series of case studies from 4 affordable housing projects in different geographic locations across the US, in New York City, in San Jose, California, in Austin, Texas, and Minneapolis, with a 5th in Ohio, in Warren, Ohio, being completed this semester. We systematically analyzed the complex forces that interact to determine why affordable housing is built the way it is. It's complicated, but these studies reveal opportunities for change to design practice, and they were fundamental to our establishing the lab and our approach to this material. Please check out these reports and find out more about this topic and view recordings of the previous 3 discussion series on our website, and I'll send you that link later. Throughout this discussion series, we've advocated for the use of HPDs, Health Product Declarations, as a way for manufacturers to accurately declare the ingredients of their products, and a way for architects and designers to see those ingredients. This is the first step for architects and designers to acknowledge chemical content and enable them to specify products that do not contain problematic chemicals. We've heard from a range of sustainability experts, an owner's rep, an industrial hygienist in the second row there, sustainability expert Amanda Kaminsky, who's also here, and architects and designers who are developing protocols to help specify better building products. We've learned that for designers who are new to this topic, it's often difficult to acquire accurate material information, that it's time-consuming to study the range of current sustainability protocols, and challenging to make the kind of changes to practice that are necessary to incorporate healthier material specification and installation. 3 of our architects who are sharing work today are in the midst of this exploration. Well, maybe they're actually a little further along than in the midst, embroiled in this exploration, exploring how their practices must change to support new specifications and new design protocols. The 4th has the benefit of a European experience that has enabled her to be at the forefront of this field. All of these presenters are design leaders, and we really want to acknowledge the importance of design-centric thinking here. But this is a fundamental part of the way we see design practice. And all of them will give us clues as to how we can all change our practice, step by step, to make better choices. 3 of them participate tonight, despite heading up their busy practices and this being the first week of school for 2 of them. Are you still on sabbatical, Andy? Andy's on sabbatical, so shouldn't even be here. And special thanks to Martha for traveling from Copenhagen. We'll look at a range of program uses, beginning with affordable housing, and then public libraries, an early childhood education facility, and to public projects and housing in Denmark to see how we can address the needs of a wide range of groups of vulnerable populations. So we're going to begin with Andy Bernheimer, and I'll just give you a little bit of his bio. So Andy Bernheimer is a Brooklyn-based architect and assistant professor of architecture at Parsons. He leads his own firm, responsible for a wide variety of residential, civic, and cultural projects, including new multi-unit affordable housing developments across the 5 boroughs of New York City, as well as award-winning private residence in the Northeast. He edited Timber in the City, a particular focus for some of us this semester, a book featuring innovative practices in wood construction. Bernheimer sits on the advisory board of the Institute for Public Architecture, is the co-chair of the Van Allen Institute's Program Council, is a fellow of the Forum for Urban Design, and is a member of the Architectural League of New York. In 2018, Bernheimer was elevated to the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects. As director of the Masters of Architecture program at Parsons from 2012 to 2016, Bernheimer oversaw a graduate program known for its connections between theory and practice, with a distinct focus on New York City's communities and their constructed environments. The program includes a signature design build studio and cross-disciplinary curricular opportunities with graduate programs in lighting and interior design. Previously, Bernheimer was a founding partner of the award-winning firm De La Valle Bernheimer, and in 2009, Think Make, a monograph of the first decade of his practice at De La Valle Bernheimer, was published by Princeton Architectural Press. Welcome, Andy.
Thanks to Allison and John Sarah Ruth and everyone at the Healthy Materials Lab for hosting this event and for inviting all of us here to discuss this issue. So I come with a little bit of bad news and also some good news. So as Allison mentioned, I designed quite a bit of affordable housing and here in New York. So I've had quite a lot of experience recently with the limitations of what we can accomplish. So I'll tell you a little bit about why that's the case. That's the bad news. I hope it's not that depressing. The good news is where things are going now and how discussions about healthy materials are now up front and part of our design process. So first, a quick teaser of some of our projects that have been finished recently. These are very quick, and this is all you're going to get from me in terms of buildings. This is a building in downtown Brooklyn, which is 130 units of mixed income and affordable housing, as well as cultural space. This is a building that's under construction in Flushing, Queens, which is 230 units of housing, all affordable, including about 60 units of senior housing, exclusively senior housing, as well as community facilities. This is recently the way it looks. And then the third project, and this is the project that I'm going to take you through, at least procedurally, for the next few minutes. This is 1490 Southern Boulevard in the Bronx. This is a building that just started construction and has 115 units of all senior affordable housing, including a number of units for formerly homeless seniors. It's about 85,000 square feet, and it should be done in about 2 years. So how do we design affordable housing? Beyond a lot of zoning, a lot of plan drawing, how do you design affordable housing? Well, in New York City, there are a significant number of design requirements. And these requirements are actually very important, and they're also very clear. So we'll note in a second what they require and what they advise as standards. These are the HPD, which is the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. This is their design guidelines, which we are all supposed to take a look at because it provides us with our guidelines for affordable housing. You get a lot of topics, as you can see. You get, I don't know, apartment planning. You get, on page 12, you get design guidelines all the way through site planning on just that one page. One example, aging in place. And again, I don't mean this too disparagingly because these are very important guidelines, but this is the page for aging in place. It's pretty straightforward, sound advice. It's very specific. It's also very overarching. It points you to a longer guide somewhere else, but the gist of this is that materiality isn't really part of the story. There are life safety issues, And I guess those are health-related in a kind of binary fashion, like if you don't follow them, people might die. But it's not health-related in the ways that we are discussing here. Here's a little bigger taste of the design guidelines. I'm sorry for the small text. But this is perhaps the closest we get to the mention of health. But this is more in the realm of mental health, and this is where it recommends that we use as much natural daylighting as possible. And interestingly, if you do a search of the HPD design guidelines, about 28 pages of text and maybe another 60 pages of diagrams, for the word health, you get 4 instances. One is a reference to an agency, the Department of Mental Health, and 2 relate to physical activity. 1 relates to brownfield developments. So the topic of material health is just really not present. There's another layer, though, which goes on, maybe overarches this one, and it can't be detached from New York City affordable housing design processes, and that's that there's a mandatory requirement in New York City that projects that go through HPD pass a checklist developed by Enterprise called the Enterprise Green Communities Checklist, and this is much more topic specific. So it's still something of a large umbrella. Development has mandatory points and some optional points. Enterprise also has an aging in place guidelines, which this is taken from, about 125 pages, though again, they're not quite written the way that we think about material health nowadays. So you can see in the general building topics, which is the 3rd column, there's a section on health and wellness and a section on finishes. So health and wellness takes you to mostly something related to air quality. And so that center is mostly on mechanical ventilation and the building envelope, with a passing reference to off-gassing, for sure, but it's not really a kind of revolutionary accounting of this issue. And here's a sample chart, right? It's very useful. Building flooring matrix. Again, it tells us what is easy to maintain, how much does it cost, mobility ease for those aging in place, all really important things regarding this building material, but nothing about friability, nothing about off-gassing, nothing about the issue of the actual ongoing day-to-day health of the residents in the building. So again, we're a bit on our own here. However, EGC, the Enterprise Green Communities Checklist, does, to its credit, offer optional checklist points for the utilization of asthmagen-free materials. This is pretty important, right? This is an acknowledgement that the specification of healthy materials is really valuable. Floorings get points, wall coverings get points, other composites. You can elect to get actually a lot of points. You can get up to 12, which is a very large chunk of what you need to get to pass through this mandatory point system with HPD if you propose and utilize healthy materials. So that leads us to this, $275. $275 is the round number. It's the basic target with some flexibility for site conditions, other complexities of design and development for affordable housing in New York City. That's a per square foot number. That is, I guess the word is, aggressive. It's a very, very, very small budget considering the cost of building, the cost of labor in New York City. So the process, forget the building shape, forget the concept of formal exploration and experimentation for the moment, forget all the structural complexities, cantilevers, materials more exotic than, say, concrete planks and utility bricks and concrete blocks. That's design process in a much more traditional sense. When we design the interiors and we choose the materials, we need education. We need to learn about the materials we don't know about. So for this last project, for this 1490 Southern Boulevard project, we actually worked with Allison and Junsar and the Healthy Materials Lab, and we brought them into the process to meet with the developer to explain the long-term health benefits of using better materials. So this was a really simple, almost actually stupidly simple learning experience for me. So this was the first time I had actually brought that into our design process, despite the fact that it seems so obvious and so actually ethically necessary to do such. So that is the kind of first way. It sounds really, really simplistic, but it's to bring people in who know more than you to help educate you about the process and to educate your clients about the process. So that manifests itself in the specifications. So a little bit of, this is where the bad news comes in, right? So this is our schedule. This is the paint schedule. This is the 100% construction documentation paint schedule, specifying paint recommended by HML, which we had in there through budgeting and through budgeting ongoing process. And this is what was submitted into the 100% CDs. And this is the qualification in the final budget. Bio paint is not included. Benjamin Moore or Sherwin-Williams conventional paint is included. So that's the qualification that we got at the very end of the budgeting process and when we were going into contract. That's because of this process. So again, I apologize for not having very many rich architectural images, but this is part of the process of architecture, which this is one of the value engineering spreadsheets that we create in our office to understand that because the costs are so tight on these projects, something has to give. At this moment, for this project, it's still the paint specification. When the developer and the operator who provides the supportive services to the residents will make decisions about VE, we have to measure certain items against other items relative to their costs, relative to the longevity of the building. And certain things make the grade and certain things don't at this first step, like special pull cords for the seniors who live in the apartments, extra notification systems and security systems for the formerly homeless, because there are transitions that they have to work with in the supportive services aspect. Even things like graffiti coatings on the ground floor need to take precedence over the interior paint spec, which is already a low VOC paint spec, but it's not what we want to do and what HML recommended to us. But that's what happens when you get to this point. So here's the good news. It took a little while. I apologize for the delay. Everyone is now enlightened on this project. So the developers are enlightened. We're enlightened. And there's a design contingency. So in affordable housing in New York City, you have a design, you carry a contingency. You're required to carry that contingency, and we've been told that that contingency gets spent, so long as it doesn't get spent on things that you didn't know were there. You get to spend it on things you want to have in the building. So this is the site last week. There's a rather large rock that cut through the site. One of the reasons the contingency was so large is because we didn't know where the rock was. It turns out the rock is not nearly as invasive as we thought it would be. And that means that there will be quite a lot, we hope, quite a lot of money. Maybe this is the thing I have to get edited out after in post-production. Quite a bit of money to refill the project with some of the things that got cut out. So as of today, 2 of the priority items, of which there are a number, to be added back into the project are better, healthier flooring, healthier paint. It sounds really, really, really minor, but it's really about as much surfacing as we can get to make this project more healthy. So that's the good news. It's the beginning of, I think, a much better, much more educated process for us and also for the clients. And thank you for coming today.
So now I'd like to introduce David Lewis. David Lewis is founding principal of LTL Architects, Lewis, Jamaki, and Lewis, a design-intensive architectural firm founded in 1997 with his twin brother Paul and Mark Suramaki, located in New York City. LTL Architects realizes inventive solutions that turn the very constraints of each project into the design trajectory, exploring opportunistic overlaps between space, program, form, budget, and materials. The principals are co-authors of the only book on the architectural section, the Manual of Section, which everybody should look at, it's a great book, and a range of monographs. The work of LTL Architects is part of the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the Carnegie Museum of Art. David Lewis holds academic positions as full professor at Parsons and adjunct professor of architecture at the University of Limerick, Ireland. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you to the Healthy Materials Lab for inviting me to present a project that is not housing, but is an absolutely critical condition of how we live, particularly affordably, and that is how we address early childhood education. Typically referred to as daycare, but it really should be referred to as early childhood education because it's critical to the foundation of any developing child. This is very much a story that's going to be a combination of the Helen Walton Children's Enrichment Center, the Early Childhood Initiative Center, which are partnering entities in Bentonville, Arkansas, as well as my firm LTL Architects, and the contractor, Nabholz, who will be critical to the conversation. Let me give you a little bit of background in terms of the nature of the project. And this is a project for a not-for-profit early childhood education center located just south of Crystal Bridges in Bentonville. It is a project we've been working on for about 3 years in a fairly sizable, at least for a New York architect, site of 8 acres, about a 45,000 square foot building, 28,000 of which is for playscapes, serving about 240 kids of a wide range of economic backgrounds. This is absolutely critical to have this facility for families in which increasingly both parents are working. And you have to have a good quality early childhood education in order to build a strong foundation. But that means also what is the nature of the materials and the health conditions of this project. Our design was very much trying to do a one-story building, in part because by code you had to have everything on ground level. You can't go onto a second floor, which meant we had a very large kind of sprawling building, single-story building on the 8-acre site. Displacing it into 4 wings so we can maximize the relationship to the outside, to maximize daylight. And this is the shot from the topping out ceremony about 5 months ago. One of the key conditions of this project was early on working with Michelle Barnes, who's the head of both of these entities, to determine what were the criteria. And for her, it wasn't energy, it wasn't LEED. It was really working with materials that were going to be healthy for children. It was also working with the indoor air quality, establishing a kind of really low maintenance project because they work on incredibly tight budgets. And to deal with environmental and social responsibilities and allow kids to understand where the place that they live in, specifically in Northwest Arkansas. For us, healthy materials doesn't begin with looking at materials. It actually begins by the design of the building. And in this case, if the challenge is going against the condition in which increasingly kids are spending almost all of their time indoors, we were going to design a building in which the best and biggest space was outdoors, in which every single classroom, and there are 21 classrooms, could have immediate access not just to the outdoors, but to outdoor classroom spaces, and then to the playscapes. All right. And these playscapes are designed with landscape architects so that the infant spaces, the toddler spaces, and the preschool spaces could be designed according to the ages, but also immediately adjacent to the classroom so kids could constantly go outside in a secure condition. Right? So that you begin by really not thinking about how do you design the interior, but how do you design the exterior so it's as inviting and engaging as possible, particularly at an educational standpoint. In this case, we were not putting in plastic forts. There's no plastic furniture, really working with natural materials, building a kind of natural playscape, using as much as possible indigenous species from the karst landscape to be able to build an environment that is consistent with learning about site and learning about environment and culture. On the inside, though, we're really important and intent upon, within a very tight budget, doing smart choices. And smart choices for us meant really looking at those materials that define the interior conditions of the classrooms and the public spaces. This is a shot of the GMRs, the gross motor rooms, playrooms, that form the heart of the building. And for us, it was really designing something so that you'd always have access to the visible outside, access to the exterior, even though that you're dealing with something where your circulation is absolutely critical for sight lines and for a sense of security. But working with the client, what we realized, what we wanted to do was not simply design a single building, but actually set up a protocol that can be played out at multiple early childhood education centers. More importantly, it wasn't just about selecting materials, it was educating a much broader set of constituents. And that is everything from those that are involved in the design process. We work with the Healthy Materials Lab here, particularly Jack Dinning, who's here in the audience, to be able to develop a project guide, which established the criteria for the project, and then a construction strategies guide to educate the contractor and subcontractors, and then working into the maintenance strategy so that you're addressing the full range of the ecology of the building. Because if you just look at the design standpoint, you put in the best, healthiest materials, all it takes is someone to put in a cleaning product and the entire process is shot. Right? So we're looking at a kind of broader educational framework with the Healthy Materials Lab allowed us to effectively expand our capacity to be able to make a case. And this case was really important given the nature of this entity. Within the Healthy Project Guide, and I'll go over some of the basic topics, we were looking at a holistic condition, really strategizing not only the material condition, but nutritional health, looking at where the food was coming from, looking at intellectual health, psychological health, exercise, physical health, et cetera. Within environmental health, digging into what were those materials that really impacted early childhood education, from asthma to obesity to attention deficit syndrome, tying those to the extent that we can to chemical conditions, looking at routes into the children's body. These are also educational tools for our design team. And then developing upon the regional impact. And this is what was really interesting about this entity, is that the Children's Enrichment Center served 240 kids, but the ECIC, or the Early Childhood Initiative Center, was an educational outreach to be able to set up a testing standard for Northwest Arkansas to raise the entire bar of all early childhood education center in that area. So what we were doing was not only just building one building, but actually setting up a manual that could be distributed to anyone who wants to design, build, renovate, or otherwise change their early childhood education center. So these things become vehicles for effectively changing a whole community's understanding and approach to the material conditions. From a contractor standpoint, one of the things that became really critical is communicating this. And so we set up a kind of manual for the contractors and subcontractors that can be distributed, establishing what were the objectives, making it really clear what the challenges are, strategies to implement, because frankly, the material can be overwhelming, so you want to be able to make it super clear what rules and responsibilities, what people should be looking out for. And to our blessing, we had Nabholz working with us as the general contractor, CM for the project, who was absolutely committed to this aspect of the project, who insisted that they learn about it, but also carry it through the course of construction, which is still ongoing. We made clear that we were looking at everything from how to deal with educating subcontractors to dangers of material substitutions during the project, particularly on tight timelines, to how to be able to deal with material spillages on the site, sort of anticipating the thought process that goes from starting and bidding the project all the way to project closeout. And we've been working very closely with Nabholz to be able to work through those issues. This means that the role of the architect shifts, so that you go from one of just specifying and designing to educating. And this is case talking to the client early on about what are we thinking about here? What are the issues? What are the types of materials we should be looking at? What are the frameworks, particularly drawing upon already existing knowledge bases, whether it's Red List or the 6 classes or information that's provided through product declarations. Meeting at bidding with a sea of contractors who are looking at the lowest price and telling them, if you're not serious about healthy materials, don't bid on this project. And that was coming from Nabholz, from the contractor, from Kurt Gober, who's the project manager for Nabholz, saying very clearly, if you're going to be involved in the project, you have to be involved and buy into this. This is serious, all right? Because the client is about 6 weeks old to 6 years old, and they're not going to be able to look up to you and tell you this is not a healthy material. And by the time they do that, it's too late. The last is when you're going into the pre-construction or meeting, the first meeting, establishing again to those bidders, these are the key conditions. From our standpoint, we want to make sure that we not only have this in the specifications as a standalone segment, but actually put this into every single section as part of the general requirements. Because if it's just in one section, that's a sustainable section, that's not necessarily going to be ripped out and given to the person doing millwork, and they're probably not going to cross-reference it. So you have to have that in every section. You must be abiding by this other section, right? And enough language to make it clear. So then you get into construction, and you think you've covered as much the best practices you have, and there's inevitable things come up. And this is why it's really important you have a team working, from the client to the contract to the subcontractors to the architect and local representatives. And I'll give you 2 examples going into construction. This is last spring. We got started laying out the foundations. They put up the steel, and then they're about ready to start laying track. One of the issues when you start laying track is you chalk the track lines, right? Single-story building, you chalk out the lines, set up the walls, and confirm it, and then they may not lay that track for a couple days. The entire thing is going to be exposed to the exterior. So what do you do on a typical job site? Well, contractor called us and said, we've got a challenge. We're not convinced that Rust-Oleum clear enamel meets your healthy material specification. In fact, it doesn't. We use this to spray to seal the chalk lines so that we know that the approved chalk line is, in fact, where we should be putting our tracks. Is this okay? And it's at that level of fine granular detail you have to have someone buying in who's calling you and say, we're not sure, this isn't in your spec, but this is methods and means, can we use it? And we looked at it and we realized that given the kind of very limited use of it, and you can see it very lightly out here, it's where it's glowing, that's where you have the spray fix effectively. It's under the track, it's going to be worn away for the most part. It's okay because there's no other, we couldn't figure a substitute, something that will deal with the wind and rain, so they're not out there constantly chalking and verifying dimensions. Right? Another example, the basic design of the rooms is down the corridor is the house-shaped form that sets up the entrance to the classroom. That house-shaped form becomes an acoustical baffle to help make the room seem smaller on the inside of the space. Acoustics are really critical to this project. So this shape is wrapped in wool, natural wool, but the ceiling up above it is the acoustical decking. We're using Tectum. Well, the Tectum, we're using all Romo Bio paints, but the person who ordered the Tectum ordered it with primer, right? Primer comes in the factory, right? And they bid it basically as a kind of, the cost of ordering it primed and non-primed is basically the same thing. We're just going to order it primed and we'll take it off the painter's budget. So we looked at it and said, you can't do that. So you actually have to use the primer that we specify in it, which then had a fairly sizable add to the cost, right? In the end, you're then looking at it and saying, is it okay to just use 2 coats of regular paint, the Roma Bio paint sprayed on, where you're going to see some of the wood that's compressed in the Tectum, as opposed to getting a primer? Is it worth the substantial upcharge that would come to do another coat in the field? And you end up choosing, based upon that criteria, that this is okay. But it was caught because the contractor's there to say, it's coming in primed, we're concerned about the priming, we check the priming, can you please look at it? So unless you have a contractor there looking at it at this close level, you're not going to meet those kind of criteria that are aspirational in the specification. The last one we're working through is that we're really happy that every one of the classrooms, and this goes back to the kind of fundamental condition of the healthy materials, is that we want the material choices to be not only as close to nature, but close to nature of the site. So every single one of the classrooms is clad in a timber that is native to Arkansas. And so every classroom is named after the particular species that is either in a lap grain or an end grain specific to that wood. So we had to work with a local lumber and forester to be able to pull those materials in. Now we're trying to figure out what's the best sealant or no sealant. Do we allow fingerprints to go on it, or we sand it off, or do we seal it, and what's the proper sealant to be able to do? Because we put the spec for the sealant in the timber wood, not in the paint spec, and it didn't get caught. So it's that level of kind of how you're negotiating when you're working with someone who's doing it effectively as a cost plus to be able to play out the project. So it's an ongoing exploration, learning experience. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And now we have the second David Levin, who's principal at Levin Betts. David is a full-time professor at Parsons from 2008 to 2011. David was director of the graduate architecture program at Parsons. We have a theme here. Yeah, and we overlapped when we were all directors, so it was nice. David was recently elevated to the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects. His firm, Levin Betts, is an award-winning New York City-based architectural practice focused on civic buildings, academic learning environments, cultural projects, and houses. Levin Betts has received both national and international recognition, including 10 AIA New York Chapter Awards, 2 AIA New York State Awards, 2 Chicago Athenaeum Awards, 7 Society of Registered Architects Awards, Emerging Voices and Architectural Record Design Vanguard from 2003. A monograph of the first 10 years of practice was published in 2009 by Princeton Architectural Press, and Levin Betts is currently working on a book of their houses.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you to the Healthy Materials Lab. And I also want to thank the Healthy Materials Lab for enlightening us in our, really showing us a lot about healthy materials, things that you start out with gut feelings and you realize that you need so much more guidance. That's what a lot of these guidelines are for. I'm going to show 4 libraries tonight. We're fortunate enough to be working with Brooklyn Public Library, civic libraries, public buildings that have many of the similar concerns that the projects that David and Andy have talked about, serving just a huge cross-section of New York City population who I think we all agree need to be protected by these projects and these materials and not toxified. I'm going to show a lot of design images. I'm going to talk about challenges and opportunities in the projects. The 2 of the 4 libraries are administered through the Department of Design and Construction, one through the Economic Development Corporation of New York City, and one through a private developer. I'm not going to be showing any guidelines because there are none at this point, and that have come through these agencies. We have recently been in conversation, as David has, with the Department of Design and Construction to make potentially 2 of these libraries pilot projects, and we look forward to working with the Healthy Materials Lab to start to create standards and to specify healthy materials for these buildings. That we have been discussing with the DDC that could turn into guidelines, much in the same way that we understand the DDC has issued active design guidelines, for example, and that's been the sort of the beginnings of a conversation. In looking at healthy materials that have run through these buildings, we've kind of looked at understood healthy materials to operate at the level, at certain grand scales, the level of the planet and its atmosphere, especially in terms of greenhouse gases, the level of the city and one's neighbors. What one does in one's building may affect another building, and I'll talk about these in libraries. And then indoor concerns, indoor air quality. These are not the 4 libraries I'm going to be presenting. The 4 libraries are in the borough of Brooklyn, as I mentioned, and these are the exteriors. 3 out of 4 of these are complete gut rehab projects, interior and exterior, as well as complete mechanical systems. The 4th in the upper right-hand corner is in an existing historic church that I'm going to show. These are our interior, these are the before conditions in the materials. I think you can smell the vinyl coming off of the floors, as well as in the upper right-hand corner, the carpeting. And these buildings were designed and built in a time without this material consciousness that we all hope that we are being led into by the Healthy Materials Lab. The East Flatbush project has the opportunities that we find in this project beyond the fact that we hope we can make a nicer looking building, has to do with bringing much more transparency to the street, as well as natural light into these buildings. We're kind of thinking about the expansion of the idea of light as a material, especially as the effects that it has on the individual, as well as the legibility through the building to the city. So a series of banks of skylights have been introduced across this existing building and cut into the structure to flood the interiors with light. In the model, you can see the ceiling tilted up and the shapes of those skylights coursing through the space, and then in evidence in this image, light and much more healthy materials than have existed in this library previously. The library is just a flat plate, no light at all inside in the reading areas. And an image looking into the library with the glow of the light from inside. So the challenges in the building, these are recent demolition shots, are obviously in removing the formaldehyde and fiberglass-based insulation, removing vinyl flooring, and then ensuring that healthy insulation goes back into the building. So the building is going to be completely insulated with mineral wool. I lied because I can't get the roofing manufacturer to warranty the roof if we use mineral wool. So we need to work on this. Yeah. And I'm going to show an image of this in a moment. And here's our roof. It's 8,000 square feet. It has neighboring buildings all around it. It has this challenge, this problem of the insulation. But and David kind of really got into this deeply. We're really in the nitty-gritty when in trying to get healthy materials into buildings. We're in the submittal phase right now, and we specified a low VOC liquid applied roof. The schedule has slipped. We're now in January. The contractor's demolishing. The submittal comes in, and based on the schedule, the contractor has suggested that we use an accelerator on the roof, which takes the roofing material from a low VOC product to a very high VOC product. So, and VOCs, as far as I understand, I'm not a scientist and I can't speak to these things responsibly, but what I've understood is that they are an indirect agent in greenhouse gases. They produce ozone, which then increases greenhouse gases in the planet. So, through much finger wagging, I hear you're going to have to tell the client that your schedule is going to increase because we can't use the accelerator. You won't allow us to do that. Because we're in conversations with our project manager from BPL, Brooklyn Public Library, we hope that we are most positive that this is going to sail forward and we can maintain the low VOC product on the roof. The next library is also this is in an existing historic building. It is a former parish hall, in a former parish hall of the church. It is an interim library sort of shoehorned in behind this parish hall for Brooklyn Public Library. This is the one fully constructed project I'm going to be showing tonight. And also it's this idea of you thinking of light as a healthy material and trying to transmit light through the spaces that would be potentially very, very dark. So using a series of strategies as well as removing the carpet and using a linseed-based linoleum flooring. This is in Brooklyn Heights. And then just simply through paint signaling the second entrance of the library. And this goes to this idea of exposing certain materials, perhaps not adding back as much to mitigate the risk of unhealthy materials being added. And that speaks to a little bit to this library. This is the Red Hook Library in a pretty severe flood zone. And the opportunities in this building, maybe once again, we hope we can make a nicer looking building, but also in trying to expose and utilize as much as possible existing materials. So it's got an exposed concrete frame, and an exposed T-beam ceiling that you can see in the little dentals. So celebrating those aspects of a pre-existing building as opposed to designing and applying more and more materials into a space. The other opportunity in this building is that it is ringed by open space, and on one side a garden that is in need of repair, and we're going to be working with the landscape architect to foster this transference, this transparency between the interior spaces and the garden, and also trying as much as possible to keep the glass, a ribbon of glass all around the building with operable windows, so that when we have nice weather, which we still do, in New York City, the flow of air, perhaps airflow as a healthy material can also be considered. Also pulling programs, the solid programs, as much as possible off of these walls so that those operable windows and the visibility to the green can be fostered. There are only glass block windows in this library right now. There's zero visibility to the outside and almost no natural light. The challenge is the flood. You'll see this flood wall that keeps creeping up and up and up. And we're also fighting against a 7-foot 1 3/4 inch underside of concrete beam dimension. So the flood wall, it wants to keep coming up, but that beam will not go anywhere. So this idea of opening up this ribbon is important to this project. Using FSC certified wood on the inside of the building, and again, these views through to the garden. The slab will most likely be, the floor will most likely be a new concrete slab of approximately 18 inches to resist the hydrostatic pressure of the water in this AE zone. And we have been discussing with the project manager to simply grind the concrete to not have to worry about adhesives and flooring. The other challenges, and this goes to the image of New York City and one's neighbors. This is Red Hook. This is Red Hook soil. If any of you have been out there, you know that there are public parks that have chain link fence around them with overgrown vegetation with no end in sight to when they may reopen. So we have to probe the soil to determine whether there are toxins underneath this existing library. And if there are, something's going to happen to the budget. We're not sure what. It's not going to be good. Borough Park is the 4th library, and the opportunities in this library are also removing materials, in this case, grinding concrete slabs and exposing a concrete encased steel frame. As you can see, the brick and the spalting, the building is in need of serious attention, which through probes we've determined is a complete removal of the brick because the steel is rusting behind. So we will be removing all of the brick and recladding this building. So the facade, which I'm going to show some images of, becomes critically important, not just for the identity, the new identity of this building, but we're also using it for solar shading, running some of the HVAC duct runs within it, the acoustical screening of the HVAC equipment, and then, of course, the increased insulation. All public buildings over $2 million in New York City have to prove a 20% decrease in greenhouse gases over code minimum. So this building will be doing that. I'm going to get to the insulation and the nitty-gritty of it in a moment. Large open reading areas, so the visibility of the concrete frame of the existing materials is going to be very important. The material nature of the neighborhood is largely masonry. So we've looked at these the different gradations of the masonry, and our design is based on a fairly lightweight glass fiber reinforced concrete in a tone that speaks of the neighborhood but stands out as a public building with a large degree of transparency into the library at the base. And then the GFRC wraps inside the space as well. And again, the concrete floor is ground and polished to celebrate it, as well as that's the ceiling that I spoke about earlier. So not putting drop ceilings, not putting new ceilings, using a material for acoustic mitigation up inside the bays, and also needing to ensure, I need your help on this, that material is not toxic. This is the last slide, and I'm going to just super geek out here for a moment, but this is all about the insulation. We obviously need to insulate the building for the increased energy performance to reduce the size of the mechanical equipment. We are right at the limits of the lot line before, and if the building bulks out farther, the glass that you see on the lower floor needs to be fire-rated glass, which is significantly more expensive. So again, as David was talking about, working within these material needs against building practices New York City code and budget and budget and budget and budget, the challenges are literally a game of inches. If that wall bulks out one more inch, the glass becomes more expensive by a factor of 3 or 4. And if that wall needs to remain that thickness, the mineral wool will not meet the R value that a less healthy material will. I leave you with that. Inches. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Martha Lewis is the final speaker this evening. Her expertise lies in a comprehensive understanding of architectural materials with a balance focused on client values, material health, environmental profile, cost, and aesthetic expression. Her keen understanding of tactile aspects of materials, combined with her strong communication skills, ensure that the integrity of the initial design is maintained from design development through construction. And as we can see, this is no small feat to be able to do that. She's an accredited professional in 2 different international certification systems for sustainable buildings, in LEED and in DGNB, which is the German system. Right, Martha? Yeah. Martha has extensive international experience designing and executing commercial and cultural buildings and interiors, both in Denmark and abroad. She's practiced in New York, Berlin, and Copenhagen, and has gained a thorough knowledge of cultural, social, and practical building parameters in Northern Europe and the US. She also has in-depth experience developing projects in dialogue with clients, consultants, and users. Through recent projects and continuing education, she's achieved significant expertise in the selection of healthy and environmentally friendly materials. Martha has gained experience in designing the foyers and conference areas of award-winning cultural projects such as the Uppsala Concert Hall, including the fixed furnishings of the reception and cafe, the Harper Concert and Conference Center in Reykjavik, and the Mørsgaard Museum. Martha has been responsible for the interior design of the Novo Nordisk headquarters and the material palettes for the Nordea Bank Corporate Center, which is LEED Platinum both in Denmark. Most recently, she's designed the auditorium spaces for the University of Cincinnati's new College of Business. Welcome, Martha.
Thank you, Allison. And thanks to the Healthy Material Library for extending this invitation to me. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. I've been employed at Henning Larsen for the last 15 years, focusing specifically on materials and design and materials and building certification for the last 11 years. Our office is based in Copenhagen, and we have offices in 6 other cities worldwide. We are a design-focused architectural firm with a very strong commitment to knowledge-based design and particular strengths in creating spaces to optimize daylight, to improve microclimate conditions, and to select healthy materials. This year, we are celebrating our 60th anniversary, and our founder, Henning Larsen, worked strategically with daylight as a design motivator to the extent that he earned the title in the Danish press as the master of light. We also have a long tradition using authentic materials, some would call them the Nordic palette, in order to articulate our architecture. A while ago, I established a holistic material strategy for the office, pointing firmly at the necessity of assessing health impacts along with the environmental and the ethical impacts in the material selection. I encourage teams to dig a bit deeper and to look at the chemical content of the products selected and to review whatever off-gassing data they could find. But because this information is often so very tricky to find, we launched in 2014 an internal material database looking at, in the first round, 100 different facade cladding materials, and focusing very specifically on 5 important aspects: the aesthetics, health and safety, the environment, ethical issues, and, of course, economy. Today, in 2019, our understanding of healthy materials is quite broad. On most projects, the focus is on using the materials to augment the well-being. For example, intensifying the daylight in a deep room or optimizing the acoustics for the internal room improvement. In other projects, we're scrutinizing the off-gassing and going into detail about the chemical content of the products. We are, however, cognizant that the negative environmental impacts, the data that comes from life cycle analysis, is ultimately a health issue. That global warming and its consequences, species depletion, the threat to biodiversity, the increase in eutrophication, the scarcity of resources, all have definitive and devastating consequences for human health. The pressure on the currently threatened planetary boundaries has an urgency and a scale of implications that overshadows the question of CMR content in materials. Ideally, our focus is on choosing healthier materials by keeping planetary health as well as project user health in our minds. There is a great variation in the intensity of our focus on these issues, depending on the project, the program, the time schedule, the fees, and the client. Certified projects yield the most thorough material investigations, and here we've worked with DGNB, with BREEAM, and with LEED certifications. This is a page from a material book where we're doing the best we can to educate the client and the participants in the project by constantly hyping, either whether it's visual or whether it's in the specifications and it's essential, but also in our communication material, we're hyping the LEED aspects, where we're going to get points because we're doing X in this material selection. The system that shines through all of these in terms of the strongest in material scrutiny, in minimizing environmental and health impacts, is DGNB, the German system that Denmark incorporated in 2011. We also have many Swedish projects where the required materials need to be reviewed and screened through particular Swedish databases. I have 3 cases I want to share with you this evening. The first one is the Middelfart Town Hall, which is in central Denmark. We completed this project in 2017. It is platinum certified in DGNB, and the town hall part of it is on the left. We did an apartment project, entire city complex, and shops, including shops, and the new town square. Only the town hall part of it is certified, so that's what I'll be focusing on here as an example of a DGNB certified project. This included a screening of all the chemical building products that came onto site in order to ensure compliance with about 30 different DGNB specific requirements for building components. These are requirements, for example, all aluminum facade elements and radiators, all metal doors need to be screened to ensure that there's no chromium trioxide in the product or in the process of producing the product. Another example is roofing products need to have very low solvent content. Third example is that we screened all of the joint compound for no chlorophens. And of course, we're looking at paint. The requirements are to fulfill particular levels of VOC depending on what the paint's used for. Unfortunately, the VOCs are the only things that are looked at in paint. DG&B could easily up their game by expanding what we need to screen for. To achieve certification, you need to have on-site measurements for formaldehyde after the rooms are completed. So this is a bit of a risk. After the room is built and you have your testing done, you need to make certain that you pass the formaldehyde tests in order to get your certification. It's what's called a knockout criteria in the whole system. Also required for the certification is the LCA, a life cycle analysis of the entire building, and you need to show that in your early preliminary design process, you were looking at comparative materials and doing life cycle analysis on a square meter, for example, in order to ascertain which is the best product in terms of environmental product impacts. Some of the consequences for our office practice have been that we had to integrate all of these chemical requirements into our specifications, and this is an extremely time-consuming process. We were, as David pointed out, we have an introductory section in the specifications, but we're also into every trade specification, and also down to every time the product is mentioned, we deliberate on the documentation necessary for each specific product. Different requirements require different documentation. So it's a very time-consuming process, and we've learned a lot in this process. A lot of spec writing is copy-paste. This will influence other projects in the office, also ones that aren't certified, because many of this is not necessarily a price increase. You just have to think about it and work it into your specifications. We also developed a log to support the contractors on site so that they could be aware of where they had requirements, what the requirements were, where they could find it in the specs, and what the documentation was required. And it was a very necessary way for us to communicate with contractors on site, because this, as many other projects, was a design-build project. So we had, as architects, had very little time on site in our contract, and we had to rely on producing these documents to keep the contractors on track, and also on a fairly active telephone contact. They were very good at getting in touch with us whenever they were in doubt, and together we managed to pull together this project that really is quite extensive in its attempt to eliminate toxic materials in the built environment. The next case is a student housing project, and this is a private investor who has gotten, in Denmark, the state gives financial advantage in financing to private developers who want to build student housing. These two projects are by the same developer, done at the same time, and both of them have to follow very strict state guidelines regarding the amount of space for each student. And there is a rent cap of about $700 a month on the student rooms. This is not a project that's certified. The state doesn't have requirements that these things are certified. The developer will also be maintaining the building. The primary driving force in the material selection on this project is the economy, maintaining this very tight budget, and also the durability of materials, which is also essentially an economic question. So this project, however, is in good hands. An architect in our office who has a lot of experience and is a devoted planetary steward. So the things that we've learned on other projects, you carry with you onto your next project. As long as the materials are meeting budget, as long as they're durable and approved by the client, this person's doing their best to push forward a very positive material selection agenda. The last case is a a new courthouse in Malmö, which is in southern Sweden. And we are in a very preliminary phase. After winning the competition, we are in startup of the fun part of material selection. In Swedish projects need to fulfill a Swedish national certification guidelines, and part of this means that the materials being used need to be screened in a Swedish chemical review database. So you type in your product, you get a red, a yellow, or a green flag, and it's delightfully easy for architects to use. You don't have to have a large chemical knowledge about what the implications are. You get the go-ahead, or you start looking for another product if you're not meeting requirements. The other very interesting aspect of this particular project is that the client is considering a new system in Sweden that's called Zero CO2. And this was established to help the building industry in Sweden comply with the EU recommendations for achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. If we're going ahead with this, this will mean that we need to have a very good understanding of the global warming potential of the materials we're using, particularly ones on a large scale. So this immediately puts this focus on what is the global warming potential of each of the materials we're considering, and how can we choose the materials that have the lowest impacts. So we're running a per square meter analysis to see where does wood land. Wood lands at the good end. Linoleum, which also has a high level of renewable ingredients, also fairly good. Rubber, you're looking at about 6-7 times the CO2 emissions that are in wood. And carpet, you're really way up there with about 12 times. The interesting takeaway from diving into life cycle analysis of materials is that you can see that the materials that are petroleum-based don't have a long life in our industry. We're having to look at organic, we're having to look at materials with renewable content in order to maintain the planetary health that is absolutely essential. And this overlaps actually quite well with the reduction of chemical content if you're not looking at the petroleum-based products, as long as you can address the fire issues, the fire safety with the organic materials, and the biocide issues. If you can screen for biocides in your wood products or your organic products, then you're on the good side of material choice. Thank you.
We have some resources. I just wanted to promote our online education materials, the Healthy Materials and Sustainable Buildings certificate course, which was developed with 58 different experts in their field, is available through Parsons Open Campus. It's a great resource if you're suddenly inspired by this conversation and you want to know more. It's really a great way to actually understand this issue, this complex issue, presented by a range of people who actually know a lot about this topic. So I would, if you want to know more about this, we can share some information. We have some information outside about it also. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also promote HPDC and the HPD and the online learning that is available through the HPDC, so check out that. And the resources, including the repository, which is also the repository of products that have HPDs that are also available through the HPDC site. So we thought we'd have a little discussion because this is a discussion series. We had some questions that we posed, but I was wondering if you all had any particular reflections on the presentations of others, of anything that was kind of interesting or enlightening or surprising to you that you heard from another's presentation this evening, and you'd just like to comment on it, and maybe we can discuss that a little bit?
I think budget seems to be an issue, just saying that.
Would like to expand on that, Andy?
Not on budget. No, I was gonna.
You can't expand the budget.
I was actually just going to remark particularly in David's guidelines, both in pre-bid, bid, construction. Those to me that was remarkable and enlightening to think that that's a process that I don't think you probably can't understate how important it is to start. So in a way, as I saw that, it felt a little bit, again, that what we're doing is so superficial, like quite literally, it's surfacing. It's those first choices for the most area, but it's not yet about a holistic process of educating, besides the developer and besides us, contractors, subcontractors, all those other parties. And to me, that's where it has to go. It has to be embedded in that kind of step-by-step process to get people on board with this. So that for me was really incredible.
Just to see, just to jump on that, just to see, even that the contractor called you and said the Rust-Oleum isn't gonna fly.
You must have scared the crap
I think the issue here, and I think there are two parts to this. One is it wouldn't have happened without the Health and Materials Lab supporting this and having Jack be part of the office for the summer, because that within the fees that are offered on a profit for a project for a not-for-profit, you don't have that framework. The second is knowing that the client wasn't just a one-off project, but their goal was to, because they have a partnering entity that's in the same building, is to certify other early childhood education centers across the area. They were committed to making sure that this project would demonstrate best practices to the extent that we know and could execute, and then disseminate it. So.
Yeah, I think also in Martha's presentation, is understanding the relationship between planetary health and human health, which shouldn't really be something to understand, but needs to be. I think that's really kind of a really important part of this overall understanding, because we spend a lot of time talking about how to make buildings more sustainable and put insulated blankets around them that may in fact be toxic insulated blankets. So these understandings, from the micro to the much more global and universal, they are very important to be made.
Is there any chance that there are proactive ways of influencing the city to make some changes? Is there a possible, has the Health and Material Library been involved in discussions with the city? Is this realistic?
I think it probably is realistic, but it's going to take time. So I wrote down, there are 3 steps that I thought about, which are educate. This sounds really trite, but educate, which is what we have to do, right? Legislate. So for me, that's actually a great question, because my take is that it's great that we're it's like a spirit of volunteerism, right? That we take this on, that you took on that process in your office and you take it on your process, whether you're compensated for it in the fees or not. It may just be a cost to the office to do this because it's the right thing to do, right? So it ought to be required, and then the last is subsidize. So for me, again, our government should be both mandating that we do this and also using the public purse to pay for this, to make our buildings, whether they're civic, whether they're subsidized by public funds or otherwise, to make these better. So right now there is not, as far as I know, there's no healthy materials initiative within the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, but there should be. So these projects, hopefully we can then use, even if it's a couple of moments, to show them why this is better, and then maybe there will be a moment when the guidelines actually require these things. They should be required. They should be legislated as mandatory. in my opinion.
Regulation is essential
Yeah.
because regulation is what you need
Right.
to have as your leverage. Is this a dialogue that with the city
with regulation. Well, I think you had some insight today, right, David, this afternoon.
Yeah, I had a meeting at 10 o'clock this morning till 12 with the DDC on a project following them. And the lab here, John Zara and David's name were brought up. We're working with it we're setting early standards for environmental goals for a project for the Brownsville Public Library, working with DDC. And we're establishing we should really be looking at healthy materials as a goal. A couple things came up. One, it's fantastic as aspirational, it'd be great. How does that deal with sole sourcing? That was the first question. Like you can't on a public project typically have a single source for a material. You have to have 3 open competitive, and you have to be able to establish on a criteria substitutions that are equal based upon criteria that are set. So it's not so easy to set aspirations because it goes into a whole range of things that the city has established in order to ensure competition and to avoid graft and greed. Because if you have a single source, that source can control the market. So if there's only one really good paint available, a little hard to be able to have competitive painting. But unless you have legislation to drive the marketplace, then it's hard to be able to have the competitive system. So those things, goes back to the sort of which one is leading which. But I do think having that conversation with the Brooklyn Public Library, with the EDC, because is really essential to be able to move this along, because there's so many other challenges that this will become one of a series of things as opposed to something that is assumed to be good best practice, right? And the hope is that it will become.
Yeah.
So,
and this goes to Andy's point to educate, because we can educate the client agencies. To speak directly to this might be part of the conversation. Brooklyn Public Library is able to have a list of proprietary items. I don't know if this came up in the conversation, but they're starting to, they can say, we don't have to have 3. We can sole source. Obviously, if the list becomes crazy long, they'll get in trouble with the DDC, and that's a constant, battle between the client agencies and the administrating agency of the DDC. But I think that this educate point to speak to your client, which clearly you guys have done, or we're all doing, so that then they adopt certain principles and then put pressure on the city agencies. So legislation is critical, but it's also we need the clients to be on board at the same time. And then but the mechanisms at the city, which then goes to all of these questions about budget and the different ways that the contracts flow through the projects are all part of this, and that's the tricky part.
Yeah, I think we saw changes in New York State and the city around the energy code,
Yeah.
So I think it's possible, and also some of the great work that's happening in California to changes in building and products generally, that it is possible for the states to make these kinds of substantial changes that impact building. I mean, we won't look to the federal government because that won't happen, but it is, I think, encouraging to hear your experience today, David, to actually understand that healthy materials are becoming an agenda item within New York City, and I think that hasn't been so in the past. I mean, I think I'm looking at Amanda Kaminsky just as reference here, but I think when we look at the environmental communities criteria, that is something that the city has adopted. That's going to be updated, I think, this year. There's going to be a new edition of that. So you see the influence of those kinds of guidelines and recommendations on buildings, and then you have something to refer to as an architect who has some kind of guideline. And if you have to abide by the criteria, for example, enterprise community criteria, there's something that you can take to your client, there's something you can take to your funder, and there's something behind you. It's not just goodwill and hopefulness that will develop. Yeah. So I think there's movement here, but it's still very complicated, and I think what's so interesting, I think, about all of your three processes is we talked about this conversation, having this conversation, is that it's quite a difficult conversation when you're new to this material to have, that it puts you in a very kind of, and I don't mean to reveal this, but it puts you in an uncomfortable position where you're not a chemist, you're not an expert in a small firm in sustainability, you're an architect, you're professionally licensed to be an architect, you have certain qualifications, but they may not extend into this area, and yet it's an area that we all want to be in. So what does that mean? So I do think even for us, for our profession, for architects and interior designers, that education becomes critical for us as well, so that we can begin at least to understand why it's an important issue.
Yeah, on that point, one of the things that we became very conscious of in the development of this project is, are we going to get everything right? Is this going to be perfect? Because you set that bar that you want to do the healthiest building possible. Well, where is that? Where does that exist? And you realize that that if you set the goal as perfection, much like communicating to students that perfection is not possible, that you actually can't do the project. But if you set it as what's the best practice that we can do now based upon the knowledge we have, that establishes, I think, a much more realistic goal, but it's also one that you can implement and learn from. And I think that's in fact the kind of the framework that we're taking within the office is what is it that we know is going to be better than something else, and where do we want to commit to, and how do we build on the next project, as opposed to the absolute perfect. So you're not presenting, and this is really important, you're not presenting to the public or to your client, we're going to do an absolutely perfect, healthy building. You can do the best and healthiest building possible, which is why you have to think about it from the design to the materials. And you want to design the building so that the use of it is as healthy as possible. Walking, active, get outside. Don't live in a bubble. Don't live in the inside. For kids, get them outside, and then think about the materials, after that fundamental decision.
Anything else that you think is important that you should add to this? I mean, imagine if you were in a small firm of your own and you really didn't know too much about this material.
Well, 2 years ago, there's more information in the last 2 years put out on this than there was 2 years ago. So, I mean, that you look like, oh wow, there's all these lists that didn't exist before. That's great. So, even our spec is out of date, and put it together 2 years ago. So we would update it and build upon not only the knowledge but the broader knowledge base. And this is one thing that I think has really been good about this distributed information community, is it's one that's not proprietary in holding, but is very committed to sharing, which I think is really, really impressive.
Yeah. So. We'll take some questions if anybody has some questions.
Thank you so much. This is a really amazing program. Thank you, Andy. You answered the question I was going to ask, which is if we're riled up, what do we advocate for? So you answered that. Thank you. I want to extend to the question of what might be possible in New York. And specifically, we heard a lot of how this all is really hard, it takes a lot of time, it takes extra money. But there was one moment, there was a twist at the end when Martha said that there's one thing that's delightfully easy, right? You talked about the Swedish materials database being delightfully easy. So I'm wondering from the others working in New York, would something like that be possible, or is it a good idea here?
The Healthy Materials database has actually been a place that we've just gone to.
So should the city just glom onto that?
Yeah, the city should, and I actually just shared it with our DDC and BPL, little library community. So they're onto it. But I think that ease of use and it's something that's delightful and easy to use it's critically important, especially at the speed and all of the other things that need to take place in order to realize these projects.
Well, there are a bunch of resources out there that new databases that are coming online that are reputable. This is the thing you want to establish, that they're actually reliable. They're not supported by manufacturers or other vested interests in them. That they're independent and that they're doing due diligence in terms of the evaluation of the material content, making sure that they're using correct chemical material data. So using things like health product declarations to ensure that there's consistency in material ingredients that are being revealed. It's a big topic, right? And so it's a combination of, understanding that there has been a problem in products, problems in terms of the chemical content in the products that we've specified for decades. So that's a problem. Understanding then what those implications are to us, to planetary health and to human health, is another part of this. And then what do you do in terms of, and vulnerabilities, right? There are particular populations that are particularly vulnerable that you should be concerned with. If you are working with, if your clients are children, very young children, if you're working with populations who've been living in poverty for generations, if you're working with seniors who have particular vulnerabilities at the end of their life, they are all highly susceptible to certain chemicals, and you have to be aware of those chemical sensitivities that you could introduce as an architectural and interior design process and eliminate those. So there are chemicals of concern that you want to particularly focus on. And then the practice implications of doing this, which are profound. Like, we know the issue, you really know the issue. And it's really difficult for us to do our work. We can't do the perfect, we can certainly do better than what we do. So I think understanding holistically what the problem is really important. But it's not just about lists of better products. It's really kind of how you make better decisions as an architect and designer. So it's embedded in your practice. It's not something that is added in at the end because it won't work. But it's really something that impacts your design sensibility and your design practice.
Yeah, and also, again, to Andy's point about educating, even educating yourself and your own practice, the people who work with you, then who you work with and rely on, and making these things come to light. It's a tricky learning curve.
Yes.
But it's also
It's like in the air, so maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I mean, there's a lot of distrust of science these days, and it permeates. And you can say it, and then it needs to be said again, I suppose, and just basically implemented within a whole series of ways that you perform your practice, from your own material library, which makes me crazy to even think about how disorganized it is. But really looking at that from this standpoint of healthy materials, and then how you run your specification, and then how you implement, which I think that the Arkansas project is really a great example of how to do that, because we spend a lot of time specifying materials and showing up on site, and it's not the material.
But
that's the pink or blue one.
There's a tricky thing here because, right, like how much, this sounds a little bit pre-apologetic, but like how much are we supposed to know? Like how much are we as architects supposed to know about everything, right? So there's always discussions about the atomization of our profession and whether or not there's hyper specialization, and we have to hire this consultant and that consultant and that consultant and that consultant and that consultant. We have an energy consultant and an accessibilities consultant and a facade consultant and a right. So, but on the other hand, like we're doing RFPs, and HML has been on our team as our healthy materials consultant on RFPs with the city. But at some point, there's a requirement or a necessity, an ethical and moral responsibility for us to be more knowledgeable about these things. But there's also the question of how much can we know? How good a job can we do at it when we have to do all these other things? So I would think that there's actually a kind of a professional opportunity for people who are scientific, who are maybe designers, who can establish professional companies that would consult on healthy materials. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for the architectural profession, that we might be seen as not knowing everything about this topic, because I don't know how we can. There are so many responsibilities on every project that we have to take on. The idea that we should also become the experts in every material that we're specifying seems ludicrous to me. So, but it's a balancing act, because we need to know enough. We have to.
Well, Wendy Victoria, who's the executive director of HPDC, she uses this is an analogy of the way that we understand structure in architecture, and that we have to conceptually understand the way that structure works, and we have to understand the limitations and opportunities that are available within any specific structure that we conceive of and conceptualize, and we basically kind of understand what it does, right? But we need to consult with our structural engineer really to design it for us in any great detail. So yeah.
Hi, Allison. We all understand the bureaucratic complexities of getting anything built in New York City, but in this context tonight, it'd be helpful if you all could talk about some of the, what do you think are some of the healthiest buildings, maybe not just in New York, but obviously even on an international level, but some of the healthier buildings that have been built in the last few years. Point to as an example that we could all kind of strive to try to incorporate some of those elements into our ongoing buildings.
Sorry, Martha.
I'm not going to Martha.
Lead with some European examples. I mean, you gave some examples. Is it helpful to hear European examples?
Well, I would say that it does work. I would say that the Living Building Challenge projects that look specifically and thoroughly at the material petal are doing very thorough investigations into a very long list of red list of unwanted substances, and that these projects are the ones that are probably investing the most time in the thorough screening of building materials. And there are 3 Living Building Challenge projects now finished in Europe. So Europe is also looking at the Living Building Challenge US initiative, and it is spreading, and this is a very positive thing. Also the DGNB buildings, although I do think their chemical review is a little bit out of date, it is very thorough in what they do ask for. They could expand, but the projects that take this on a serious level for DGNB and are certified are very focused on particular building components, not all, but yeah, that's what I would, and that is very European, the DGNB, but Living Building Challenge, all of that's available in English.
We've had various participants from this discussion series who've added a lot to this. So something to do, I'll send you the live stream version so you can see. Perkins and Will as architects have been leaders in this field for forever. Amanda Kaminsky's work at Durst and subsequent work that Durst is doing in the city as a developer who really takes on sustainability writ large, I think, is somebody to look at. Harvard, we were just at Harvard. Heather Henriksen presented just before the holidays. Harvard has excellent building protocols they've developed in collaboration with HBN and with others, really kind of motivated and spearheaded through Heather's deep desire to do a better job there. So you can, and all of their sustainability guidelines are online and really interesting to reference in terms of an owner, a big developer, and somebody who's managing a lot of large square footage of office space. Amanda, who would you add to this kind of list of exceptional buildings in New York City locally?
I would say there are. I see moments of progress in some of the work that I interface with. Going back to DDC, sometimes there's a spec writer at DDC who's one of my favorite people to work with in the infrastructure unit because he's seen challenges with some of their procurement just from a logistical standpoint and being constrained by not being able to purchase some of the materials that are listed materials in their spec, and then kind of zooming out and looking at, well, how could we make improvements to this on a broader scale because we might not. Yeah. Exactly. And so he's been able to insert other materials that are more holistically healthy, both from a carbon standpoint and a human health standpoint, by re-examining some of the flaws in how their specs have been for 50 years, maybe. So I think it's more for me about sometimes zooming into these moments of progress and then looking at I think that there's such an importance to looking at this on a municipal scale. And I think that's where, at least in the U.S., we have a lot of opportunity because municipalities are so energized right now because of a lack of action at at the federal scale. So I think that's what I get excited about, and I get excited about raising the baseline because that's what's so needed right now. I mean, it's really wonderful to see exemplary projects, and it gives ideas for how we can raise the baseline. Because our baseline's really failing in a lot of ways, I think here too, and it's not for lack of effort on a lot of city agencies' behalf. I think it's really hard, but it's. I hope that there can be maybe even more communication between city agencies too, and I think that makes it easier over time to see the big picture. But that's that it's hard, but it's not impossible, and that's where I really get excited about a lot of improvement. I didn't really answer your question exactly, but I think, yeah.
It reiterates some of the conversations.
Yeah. For me, it's not about whole projects that have been exciting, but maybe individual people that have had an outsized impact on what can happen. And yeah, again, raising that baseline is so important. Because if we're not doing that, why are we doing any of this, right? Yeah.
I think the challenge from looking towards outside entities or looking towards consultants is to try to determine in this incredible sea of information and certification process, which one do you look at? Do you look at cradle, ones that avoid the red list, that have met really high standards? Then the challenge is, does that give you the flexibility to work to be able to meet budget? And that's where increasingly we find the challenge is that the bar may be very high set, but it may be so limited to be able to meet aspirational goals at this point. And the hope is that will change. That hopefully answers the question.
Yeah, well, I would say two things are really important. And for me, I would really like to have the transparency and the declaration, what is in this, down to a 0.001%, just to know what is in there. But then you have the challenge of, okay, you have all that information, and then it's just too much information if you have to be quick about it. So in that case, I think that it's really good to have both, where you have this thorough declaration that is third-party verified, and that's the ideal situation. And then an organization, an independent organization that has very transparent criteria, so that you can begin to get a sense, oh, this I actually should avoid, or no, this will actually benefit my project. So I think we need both, because not everyone has the time to really understand to the degree that you need to understand. We're not chemists. So this helping hand of an independent database is really a plus.
Okay, I think we should go have a drink now.
Organic wine only.
I like to